Hello and welcome back to Harriet's History Vlogs. Today I will be speaking about Alexander III's death and the end of the Canmore line and what this meant for Scottish independence. When Alexander died, he was travelling on his horse to visit his third wife, Queen Yolande, when a storm hit near Kincardine, which caused him to fall off his horse and die. This caused shockwaves throughout Scotland, as it meant that the royal Canmore line had come to an end. All his children had died before him and predeceased him, and there was no male heir to inherit the throne, so primogeniture could not be applied, which caused Scotland to go into deep political uncertainty. Once Scotland realised that there was no king to rule them anymore, they scrambled for any sort of action to be taken so that war did not break out all over Scotland. In April 1286, they come up with a solution which makes sure that Scotland would be taken care of, as there was no longer a king left to look after the kingdom. This was when the community of the realm appointed 6 guardians, which was made up of 2 bishops, 2 earls and 2 barons, all of which were important figures in Scotland at the time, who swore over everything that they would look after Scotland and put all their interests to the side. While they were ruling, they took action and asked help from Edward I, who was a long-time ally of Scotland and a friend of Alexander III who had expertise in law. They reached out for legal advice from him, as they did not know exactly how to handle the political uncertainty that Scotland had been plunged into. However, this was a big mistake, as they had unwittingly invited an English king to interfere in Scottish politics and law. While this was going on, there was tension growing between the powerful noble families in Scotland in the winter of 1286. Because there was no king of Scotland, many of the families believed that they could forcefully take the throne for themselves if they ruled over the majority of Scotland. The majority of the tension was between the Bruce and the Comyn families and the Balliol families. This tension increased the threat of civil war, which scared the Guardians and meant that action needed to be taken soon. The Bruces attacked the Balliol castles in the southwest in Wigton and Dumfries, which in turn meant that the Comyns mobilised in the north ready for battle. This meant that civil war was likely to break out if drastic action was not taken, and meant that it weakened Scotland even more to English aggression. The Guardians knew that action had to be taken to stop an outright civil war, so they found their solution in Margaret, Maid of Norway. They found that she was the next closest heir under the custom of Talsey, which meant that she was somewhat related to Alexander and could rule Scotland in the place of the deceased king. However, there were a few problems with Margaret which made many of the nobles in Scotland very nervous that she could properly provide as a leader of Scotland. She was still very young, and we need a regent to lead in her place for many years until she was of the age that she could make decisions for Scotland. She was also a female, which meant that she would not be able to lead troops into battle, which would make Scotland vulnerable to attack, while she was still young and mean that it would be easier for other countries to grasp influence. This meant that even though it did provide a small solution, it did not provide any greater solutions for the problem of Scotland's political uncertainty. However, all these problems seemed to cease when the Treaty of Bergen was proposed, which was a marriage treaty between the Maid of Norway and Edward I's son, in July-August 1290. This treaty was perfect, as it agreed that even though Edward's son would be marrying a monarch of Scotland, that it would have full independence from England. This resolved all the problems that Scotland seemed to face and was a perfect solution that the Guardians were looking for. However, the marriage actually had to take place for all the agreements of the treaty to place, which may never happen. The worst did actually happen when the maid died on the way to Scotland, when she fell ill near Orkney on a boat just off the coast of her destination. This meant that Scotland, yet again, had no one to take the place of Alexander and plunged Scotland back into another succession crisis. This meant that the Treaty of Bergen was no longer relevant and meant that Edward no longer had to follow the agreement, they had to respect the agreement that Scotland would remain independent. This opened Scotland up to English interference and takeover like they had never faced in that era before. To make matters worse, many nobles were starting to treat Edward like an authority figure in Scotland. Many nobles started to appeal to him, trying to get him to support them in their claims to be the new King of Scotland. The 2 most important and relevant were Bishop Fraser, who supported Balliol, and appealed to Edward to choose the next Scottish king for them. Bruce also appealed in a document named the Appeal of the 7 Earls, which requested the King of England's support for his claim. This meant that Edward was invited and requested to take part in Scottish political affairs, which meant that it was even easier for an English takeover of Scotland. Edward decided that he would take up the request of the Scottish and decide who would be the next King of Scotland. He made all of the contenders to the throne accept him as overlord before he would even make a judgment on who would be the next monarch of Scotland. This meant that even before the new King of Scotland was crowned, they would accept an English king as their superior, meaning that Scottish independence was fully undermined. In conclusion, the death of Alexander III caused a great amount of political uncertainty throughout Scotland. It meant that there was no king and leader of Scotland. It caused English interference, and all the events that took place after his death were a downward slope into English occupation.